So do you ever forget to make or purchase tags for your holiday gifts? I'm probably the worst for having all my presents wrapped and going, oh no, I don't have tags for my presents. So today I wanted to show you some very simple tag designs that can be done very quickly that you can add to your gifts. And if we haven't met yet, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So let's get started. So let's talk about the types of tags we'll be using today. You can really use any tag. These are Ranger Manila tags that I buy. I usually have about 20 or 30 of them around, so I usually grab them and use them in my projects. If you don't have your own tags, basically just cut a rectangular piece of paper and just snip off the edges. But I will include in the description below where you can get these particular tags. I'm going to use 3 of them to do 3 different watercolor backgrounds. So these backgrounds are going to make very simple. I'm just using my watercolor paints and grabbing a little bit of turquoise, and I'm basically just adding it onto my tag in a wash. This is a very simple idea. You basically just want to add color to the background. If you don't have watercolor paints, you could use, if you have Tombow markers, those are more of a water-based marker. You could use your regular markers for this. You could use inks. You can use almost anything just for coloring up these backgrounds. It isn't meant to be really complex, it's just meant to add color down. And I like mixing the color, and I like adding a little bit of turquoise and then moving to Purple Lake and coming back with more turquoise. And you can see that when you mix the colors together, you get different colors. So I'm getting a more deeper blue between the mix of that Purple Lake and the turquoise. I'm just going to just add it a little bit more along the edge here. Maybe add in just a little bit more of that deeper purple. So that's basically the first tag done. One thing I like to do sometimes is I do have this Distress Mica spray. This one's a tarnished brass one. And so I want to shake up the spray. You can see it's gotten quite shimmery. And just adding a few spritzes on my tag. And that just adds a little bit of shimmer. It helps the colors meld together and just creates a really nice background. I wanted to show you 3 very simple color combinations. And this is for people who maybe don't know how to mix very well with your watercolor paints or are new to watercolor. I know the mixing part can be the most difficult part, so that's why I wanted to cover it today. So far I have used my sap green and I'm using some Viridian hue. Because green is next to yellow on the color wheel, we can also add in some yellow. So I'm going to add in this warm New Gamboge yellow. So that gives it a little bit more of that really warm look to it. You can also add in some lemon yellow, which is going to give you a different hue, almost more bright green hue on your tag. And we're just basically just mixing some greens here. Actually, I'm liking the lemon yellow a little bit more than I'm liking that New Gamboge. I want to go for a little bit more bright and brilliant with this tag. So add a little bit more of that Viridian, add in a little bit more of that sap green. Depends on kind of what kind of colors you want for this Christmas tag. I always think of green when I think of Christmas. So you can kind of go back and forth until you find something that you really like. I'm going to add a little bit of that tarnished brass mica. And again, I'll add this link below as well so that you know where you can get some of these products. I'm just going to set that aside to dry. So with this one, I'm going to try to do a variety of colors. I wanted to add in red, but the hard thing with red and green is they are opposite on the color wheel, which means that if you mix them together, I'll do a little pull here. If you mix red and green together, you get mud. You get kind of a blacky brown gray color, which is really not what you want on your surface. So I'm going in with a little bit of this red. I'm adding it to the surface. And I'm going to go in with a little bit of a blue. And that cobalt blue and that green actually make a decently nice purple. Because not every blue and red make a really nice purple. Some of them make a lot of mud. So then from here, now I'm going to go in with a little bit of green. And what you'll notice is by doing this, so you can have the red, the green, and a little bit of the blue, but you do need that color in the middle just so that you don't end up with complete mud. The nice thing about that blue is now you end up with a really nice green. But at the same time, you can mix it up and you can move it up a little bit. We can bring the red down and not have to worry too much about having really ugly blends. And if you're getting too much water along the edges, because this thing is curling, you can lightly dab at the edges. It might remove some of it like I've done there. And if that happens, then just, you may want to come in with us a little bit more color. And, oh, that is not a clean brush. Just add in a little bit more color and maybe just dab your paintbrush so it's not very wet and just come more in with that straight color. And that's a way of being able to just continue to blend that a little bit. For here I have that ugly area there, so I'm dabbing my brush off the surface onto my paper towel, and that's a way of getting rid of some of those lines. So I'm going to add in a little bit more of that cobalt. A little bit more of a mix there. My water's pretty dirty, so I'm getting a little bit of red hue in there, which is not ideal, but that's okay. It happens. These are meant to be very easy and not too stressful in the design, so that's why I'm not caring a ton that the colors aren't perfect. So this is a little bit muddier than what I wanted, but it'll still work. And the thing with these tags is they're not the same as watercolor paper. You could cut your watercolor paper into tags and you'd probably get a little bit better result than what I'm getting here, just because it's going to soak into the paper instead of trying to go along the edges like this is. But I wanted to show you what to use with something you already had on hand. Again, just spritz that with a little bit of that tarnished color and just set aside to dry. So now that these are dry, let's take a look. So they do dry a lot lighter, and because I added in the mist, it ended up blending them a little bit more than I originally planned. But I'm fine with that because you can see that having a more smooth tag with some variation is also really nice. So the green one ended up probably the smoothest. This red one is a little bit muddy in there, but I don't mind it because I don't mind those slightly more muted tones. And for me, that looks almost more like an interesting landscape. So I really like that one. And this one, I just really like those blue and purple colors together. So you can see that creating that base layer is quite simple. It's quite fast. And then from there, we can start looking at adding layers. So they can get a little bit crinkly. I dried mine with a heat gun, and you're going to get more crinkliness when you dry with a heat gun than if you just let it dry naturally, but I didn't want to wait. And I know if we are in a place where we're trying to finish things before the end of the year, we may not have a ton of time to wait around for things to dry. You may want to try to get your project done and just move on. So the easiest way to decorate these is with a little bit of ink. Ink and a stamp. Or if you don't have stamps and you don't have ink, write in your own writing. Add in your own doodles and Christmas messages on them. You don't have to always use stamp pads or other things, but what I find is they're just really easy for getting images down. They don't take very long. And so I have my season's greetings, and that looks beautiful. But I'm going to go around it with this little sprig of pine cones and pine leaves. And this is from the Yuletide Gathering Stampers Anonymous stamp sets. I particularly like the Stampers Anonymous stamp sets just because I find them quite versatile. Some I've had 10 years, some of them I've had 2. They have beautiful designs. They work really well on a variety of projects, and I just find that they just age so nicely that you can use them year after year. And I'm going to mix this up a bit because the pine cones are kind of facing downwards, so I don't really want them facing up. But I have holly, and this stamp I've actually never used until today. It's one of these stamp sets that I haven't really used that much, and I don't know why. The art's gorgeous, but I also don't do a ton of Christmas projects. I'm not one of those people who spends their time from September on doing Christmas things. It's usually something I do a little bit more seasonally than probably most people do. You just want to think about where you want to lay it on your tag. In this case, I'm just going to add it there, and that holly is just fantastic. I love that look. So again, you don't have to stick with just one stamp set or one idea. And because I have these other little bits of pine, I'm also going to use them. I think I'm going to add in a little bit of the holly there too, because I want this to be mixed, not just holly at the bottom and the other things at the top. I want this to look a little bit more cohesive. So we're going to add in a little bit there. And there's one more spot, so I'm just going to keep stamping because it's fun. So there you go. By adding in a little bit of stamping, you now have one completed tag, and that did not take a lot of time. It was basically just add some color and add some stamping. So for this next one, I'm going to add in a little bit of background stamping. And this one, I think I want to go a little bit more subtle with it. So I'm going to be using one of my old Colorbox Fluid Chalk ink pads. Fluid Chalk ink pads are not as popular as they used to be. I think there's a few brands that still carry them. I will put some options below for where you can get chalk ink. I like chalk ink just because of the look of it. It has a little bit of a different finish. Another one that would maybe be similar to it, but is definitely not chalk ink, is the Tim Holtz Distress Oxide inks. They work very similarly. So for this one, I'm just basically adding in stamping all the way up my tag. The reason that I want to use blue instead of black is that I want to make this a background color and a background image and texture. I don't want it to compete with the other layers on top. So we're going to start by just adding in a little bit of textured color before we add in our next layer. So for this next layer, I'm using the Falling Stars layering stencil from Tim Holtz. I love this particular stencil. It works perfectly for these beautiful backgrounds. And so I'm adding in some Distress Oxide spray. I think I need to clean the nib of it. It's getting a little bit funky and it's not spraying super well. But this should generally spray a lot better than it is. It usually gives me more consistent spray. I think I just need to clean the nozzle. I'm sorry, I did smudge a little bit below there, but you can see that now we end up having a layer of stars. So this tag is now dry, and you could go in on top and add more of the black stamping and just do something like that. But I wanted to show you another option, which is to add simple die cuts. These ones I cut out of foil paper, and these are from one of the Simon Says stamp collections. And what I love about it is you get the shape, but then your offcuts from the shape putting it through the die is you get these little pieces here. And so I don't waste those pieces. Instead, I add them along the edges here just to create a few more shapes to my night sky. I'm going to add them in like that. And this can be attached with any glue. So I'm using this art glitter glue just because it's what I use for almost everything. You don't need to add perfect adhesion around everything. This glue will dry clear, so it's a very easy one for just adding shapes. And so just add a few dots here and there and just clean up the shape a little bit. Make sure at least most of it sticks down. I'm going to add in the other ones, and then we're basically done with this tag. And with this last tag, you're going to go even with a few more layers. What I'm going to do is again go back in with that stamp, but now what I'm doing is I'm doing more than one value on it. So instead of stamping just the first value, I'm also stamping the second and the third. And the reason for that is just to try to have that be a little bit more subtle than just straight black on black. I'm going to go in with another star shape, but this one I'm going to use the mica spray that we used before. So this is going to be extremely subtle. You're not going to notice it very much. It's more of one of those little details that we add when we're layering that isn't meant to really stick out a lot. It's just meant to add a little bit of interest and shimmer. So you can now see that I've sprayed through. It's quite wet. So we want to let this dry. Again, we're looking more into subtle layers so we don't take away some of the other layers. So we're looking at 4 or 5 layers. You don't want to go too crazy with adding every layer at the same intensity. If you add them all at the same intensity, they're going to lose that effect. You want to try to build layer on layer and have little things show through and have other things show on top. So now we've done similar layers that we've done before. Again, we have 3 layers at this point. We have the watercolor, we have the stamping, and we have the spritzing. Now I wanted to show you what you could do with an embossing folder, because a lot of us have embossing folders. I've had tons of these things over the years for cards and for different textures, just to create more texture in my art journaling pages and in my other projects. And so I'm just going to put this in, and I'm just going to put this through my embossing machine, which is just off camera, and I will be back in a second. So you can see once you run it through the embossing folder, now you have texture. Because I do have a spot just below where the embossing folder is only so long. It's a little bit shorter than the tag. This is where I can go in with my Merry Christmas and just add it in that space below. And you could call that done, but I wanted to show you one bonus technique. So I wanted to show you what you could do if you wanted to try to have a little bit more variation and bring out the lines in this embossing image. And that's using Distress Foundry wax. This is a wax that can be spread with a paintbrush. It can be rubbed on with your finger. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. You need to shake it really well before you start. And then I'm putting a little bit just off to the side here. You can see it comes out quite liquid, but you got to work quickly because it does dry fairly quickly. And I'm not adding it to every spot. I'm just adding it to a few places just to help that shine come through. I'm trying to look at putting it on the high points. You can do them perfectly, or you can choose to do it a little less perfectly. In my case, I'm purposely just trying to get some of the high points, trying to get the centers of some of those stars. I did this in another take. This one's a little busy for this technique, but you know, it's going to show up a lot better once we heat set it because this works like an embossing powder. And if you're not familiar with embossing powders, just check out one of my other videos, especially the ones on embossing glazes. Those ones I go into a lot of detail about heat setting and how you can go about getting really great images using embossing powders. And the glazes are super fun too. Because they are semi-translucent, they're a really good choice for stuff like this. But what I like about this Foundry wax, it is easy to paint on, which a lot of the other waxes aren't. So that's why I particularly like this one for my projects. And even though it looks very dim right now, we're going to shine it up a bunch with a little bit of heat. And then if you want to just add a little bit more shine, you can always just rub a little bit along the edges with what you have left. And as you leave it out, you have to work fairly quickly. Otherwise, it's going to basically just dry almost into like a sandy, very dry feel to it. So be aware of that as you're using this wax. And you need to use a paintbrush you don't care as much about. I'm basically cleaning that one up and wiping it off with a baby wipe. But to be honest, it's not great on your brushes. So I use cheap brushes when applying this medium. So the beauty of the Foundry wax is actually shown in the heat setting. So once you heat set it, now you have a lot of really beautiful shine. You can see a lot of those edges. You can see where I wasn't being as careful with my paintbrush as I should have been. I have another example of this one. It's almost the same take, just different background color, and I didn't add the stars in. In this case, this might be one where you almost want to go a little bit more simplistic, where you have the background, the embossing, and then the waxes, just to try to not have too many layers to take away from that main focal image. And one thing I did in this take, which I haven't done yet in this take, is basically use my gold pen to outline some of those edges. That's a really nice way of helping this pop. And this particular pen, this Pen Touch Gold pen, is one of my favorites for creating these little drop shadows, just because the color is so strong and so shiny, and it works beautifully on a project like this. Just by adding in just a few layers, you create really beautiful, really quick tags that can add to any of your gifts. Why I like using the big size of these tags is that you have lots of room on the back to write a Christmas message. Instead of having a separate card, what you can do is just add this to your present and write something on the back. The other option is you could actually put these on a piece of cardstock and turn them into an actual card. And these beautiful tags also work well in the art journal. You can add these in as focal images to your art journal or as layers in your art journal. There's so many options for how you can use these tags with these beautiful layers in your creative projects and in your gifts. And so if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss on any future videos. And if you'd like to see more Christmas projects, click here. This is my playlist of all my different Christmas projects, from very simple ones to fairly complex projects. So I'll see you in the next video.